The traveler once asked Venti a very interesting question about ascending to Celestia, and it's if ascension means that you will become a god. To which Venti described the origin story of 3 creation myths that had their gods sacrifice their bodies for the sake of the world. Godhood in Genshin Impact is not seen as this beautiful or all-powerful status that promises endless rulership overall, but rather immortality laced with unimaginable responsibility, obligation, and pain. However, there are those that covet these powers and wish to use them for their own benefit. And with that, we ask the question, how do you become an Archon? Disclaimer: though this video is based on the lore, the information isn't completely indicative of the final product. I have a lot of speculation when it comes to Archonhood and Godhood because the lore hasn't completely explained it too. But nevertheless, I want to understand how to become an Archon because many characters have actually toyed with the idea of ascension or becoming and creating something greater than God. So with that, let's begin. According to the lore, an Archon in Genshin Impact is defined as a creature with authority bestowed upon them by Celestia through the use of the Gnosis. The Gnosis is symbolic of their divine authority and their divine seat, and the Gnosis grant the Archons power extending beyond their original capabilities. The Gnosis are allegedly the remains of the third Descender, fashioned into what they are currently now thanks to the first and second Descender. We don't have complete information about this yet in the lore. The concept of Archons happened after the death of the third Descender and after the Archon War formally ended, as that was the whole point of the exchange. As far as the lore is concerned consistently, there are only 7 Archons, with any other creature that used to preside over a nation stated as a god or a deity, but never an Archon. Archons are also creatures with innate elemental control, with the Gnosis only serving as enhancement rather than concrete batteries. These Archons are also categorized by their name being derived from the Ars Goetia, or the Limikaton. All the candidates of Archonhood, such as those that have lost in the war, are speculated to have also exclusively only Ars Goetia names, such as Hagentes, the Caribbean, Osail, and Orobashi. However, we do have participants in the Archon War that do not have a confirmed Ars Goetia name. But moving on from that, let's answer the question of how do you become an Archon? Number 1 is to win the Archon War. This one is the simplest and confirmed way to become an Archon. Complete domination of the nation's authority without contest. The Archon War was a war amongst the demon gods mandated by Celestia to determine the god who had sole authority over a territory. It is also observed in the lore that unless you had one valid demon god, the Archon War is fated not to end. This was the case with Orobashi and the twin gods Baal and Beelzebul. By some unknown fundamental decree, the Archon War only formally ended with Orobashi's death due to his prophesied demise as punishment for his transgression. Whether it was because of this pending prophecy or because he still was a valid contender for the war is currently unknown. But the Archon War was not considered to be formally over even though Makoto was recognized as the Narukami. It was also stated in the treasured tales of Chokan Shikagoechi that A had to give up her bodily form so that Makoto could ascend to the Heavenly Citadel, furthering the idea that the conditions of the Archon War require one certified winner per nation. Though A discredited the books in her voice lines, she does mention that it was only after the war with Orobashi that the books become wishful thinking, which would still make the current volume we have credible because according to the lore, A was already Makoto's Kagemusha during the war with Orobashi. We also know that spirits and incapacitated demon gods, though their essences may be alive, are considered to have lost the Archon War regardless if they're still around after the Archon's ascension. This would explain Marchosius and Andreas' cases. The overall concrete definition of winning the Archon War, though, is unknown. Number 2 is to be appointed by the previous Archon. Succession was first somewhat introduced to us through Makoto and A, then Rukkhadevta and Nahida, but most clearly with Egeria and Fossilor. Fossilor mentions that the previous Hydro Archon passed on the responsibilities to her post-mortem. We also know that creatures that were once creations could potentially be the next Archon. So for example, if Fossilor, an Oceanid, was given authority by the previous Hydro Archon, then that means Kabukimono could have technically been Inazuma's Archon should A have perished and the succession was complete. The two Hydro Archons' relationships also remind me of Istaroth and Barbados, in which Venti is also known as the Thread of the Thousand Winds, a moniker that was popularly used with Istaroth. So Barbados could have also been a creation, or at least an aspect of Istaroth that ascended to godhood. That would explain why Istaroth is also co-worshipped with Venti for a slight period of time. However, Venti isn't Istaroth's successor because he's the first Anemo Archon. Istaroth was never recognized as such. The real question, though, is if there is a rite of ascension similar to what happened in the Archon War. We're not sure if the next generation of Archons were given the same ascension rite of recognition as the previous Archons, because we were told that Makoto had descended and Zhongli currently has a contract with the Heavenly Principles for unknown reasons. It is unconfirmed, though, if that level of formality was extended to the next generation. But I do like to think that there is a case like that, where the successor is required to be formally presented before Celestia. Or maybe it's similar to bestowing a vision, in which divine authority is bestowed upon them arbitrarily after the death or incapacitating of their predecessor. Number 3. Co-rulership between two gods is possible, but not between two Archons. Co-rulership between two gods is possible for one nation, but only one of the gods is recognized as an Archon in the eyes of Celestia. This is why in the lore, King Deshret and Nabu Malikatta are referred to as God Kings, but never explicitly the Dendro Archons despite their co-rulership of Sumeru. Urabashi and Baal also used to have a peaceful co-rulership of Inazuma, and Istaroth and Barbados were co-worshipped by the people of Mondstadt at some point in history. This was an important point during the Archon War because some gods had alliances and assemblies despite supposedly being competitors. So with that point, it is important to consider that under Tevat's current requirements mandated by the Heavenly Principles, all nations must be under the rulership of an Archon at any given time, regardless of how many other gods and deities are present. This fact was only tested and broken by Fossilor during her execution, where she willingly destroyed her seat. What the repercussions of these actions are currently unknown, but we know she needed so much power to defy the principle. Number 4. The current Archon seat must not be occupied by a living creature. For succession to occur and respected by Celestia, we know that the current Archon seat must not be currently occupied by someone else. This is why despite Zhongli retiring, Morax is still the Geo Archon in the eyes of Tevat's fundamentals. Furthermore, this is why Beelzebul was not formally known as the Electro Archon until Makoto's formal death. Now here's the weird part about Genshin lore. There's a lot of different nuances and a lot of specifics that go into definitions, and I'm just going to list some of them that I've seen every time that I try to open the Genshin archive. Number 1 is that the title God is not the same for everyone, especially when it comes to humans using it. The lore uses the word gods multiple times to describe the Archons, but godhood is not the same as Archonhood. An Archon is only a status of a god, and it's possible that there are higher and lower echelons of divine deities in Tevat mythology. For higher echelons, the Heavenly Principles, the Primordial One, and the Four Shades interchangeably or otherwise are considered as such. Equal echelons are gods like King Deshret, Beelzebul during Baal's rule, and Scaramouche at the height of short-lived divinity. As for lower echelons, the Adepti and other eliminated beasts have been referred to as divine creatures and sometimes gods by the people who worship them. So the term god colloquially has been very subjective. So when you read the lore, be careful because Archon and god are not usually interchangeable. Number 2 is we don't know a human who has ascended to Archonhood. This one is a very interesting question considering several NPCs have toyed with the idea of becoming something greater than the gods. The manga also opens if ascension equates to godhood, which is not actually the case. As of the moment, while a creature is of the same power caliber or status as an Archon, they are not the same. Unless you are directly appointed by Celestia, recognized by the previous Archon and the Heavenly Principles as the Archon of their respective nation, or through other mysterious circumstances, you are not the Archon. Furina and Fossilor was a point of contention for this argument, but Furina actually never ascended to godhood the same way that the other Archons did. Now that Fossilor is dead and essentially the last threads of divinity are gone from Furina, she is nothing more than a human. Though Genshin's media still does respect her as the Archon, the destruction of the Divine Throne in lore means that the power and authority has been returned to Neuvillette. We also don't know if being an Allogene allows you to become a god. Number 3. Having the Gnosis in your possession does not make you an Archon. This one was a very heated argument that I saw because people were saying that Zhongli and Venti were no longer Archons because they didn't have their Gnosis, but respected A as such even though she clearly doesn't have hers. Archonhood is not transferred through Gnosis ownership, and this is very important. The Gnosis, though it's a battery, doesn't determine who the Archon is just because it is in their possession. So characters like Yaimiko and Scaramouche did not temporarily become the Electro Archon, and the Sarisa is not currently the Archon of the different nations due to possessing them. Number 4. Retirement does not leave behind your status as an Archon, and an Archon's death does not automatically mean the relinquishing of a divine seat. This one is interesting when you consider the fundamentals of Genshin's history. If you notice the timeline of rulership in Tevat, there is hardly a moment in the 7 nations where the nations aren't technically under the rulership of an Archon or a deity, even if the previous Archon passed away due to different circumstances. The 7 nations must, for some unknown reasons, always have an Archon ruling over them. This is a very subtle constant in Genshin's lore that remains with Celestia's themes of prophecy, fundamentals, and principles. Before Fontaine, we actually don't know a nation that ever went through a confirmed period where they never had an Archon. Liyue and Mondstadt are still currently under the rulership of Marax and Barbados respectively. Inazuma's transition was instantaneous, with Baal being immediately replaced with Beelzebul. Sumeru never technically lost Wooer despite Rukkhadevta and Nahida being two separate entities at that point. And the Tsaritsa still rules over Snezhnaya for as long as before the Cataclysm. The only proven exception to this is Fossilor, who deliberately went out of her way to defy the fundamental principles of the land and destroy her divine throne. But it was never the case that the Hydro Archon's throne was ever empty. The Hydro Archon role was never empty because of Fossilor being the successor to Egeria. Instead, it was effectively erased. Now, there's one important question that continues to linger in Genshin's lore, and I actually want to know. What happens now that there's no Hydro Archon? The powers and authorities of the Archons are directly connected to their seats, and we know that it is fundamentally possible to defy the heavenly principles and return the power to the sovereign associated with their element. This also confirms that Archonhood was done as a response to the sovereigns, as a means of translating the power of the previous rulers of the world into something that can be controlled or surveyed under Celestia's gaze. But the question is now, what happens that the Divine Throne is broken? I imagine that if the heavenly principles came back, they wouldn't let Fontaine's transgression against them go unpunished, especially since Archonhood is so fundamentally rooted in Tivat. What Fossilor did was essentially blasphemy, which could jeopardize the safety of Fontaine in the future. This also means that, in a way, Fontaine is currently at the same status as Khaenri'ah, or even much worse considering that they quote-unquote defected from the intended order of Celestia. But that's it for me today. A short and sweet video to start off 2024, and Happy New Year!